The sea had finally become still. Just moments earlier, towering walls of water had stood on either side of a narrow path, allowing an entire nation to escape what seemed like certain death. But now, the waters had returned to their place, swallowing one of the most powerful armies on earth. On one shore stood the Israelites. For the first time in generations they were free. Behind them lay the lifeless remains of Egyptian chariots, horses and soldiers, the very men who had sworn to drag them back into slavery. As the morning sun rose over the Red Sea, voices that had once cried out in fear were now lifted in celebration. Moses led the people in a song of victory, while Miriam danced with the women, praising God for a miracle that would be remembered for thousands of years. From that moment, the biblical story follows Israel into the wilderness, toward Mount Sinai, and eventually toward the Promised Land. But what if we've been looking in only one direction? What happened on the other side of the sea? Back in Egypt? What happened when the army never returned? Who carried the devastating news back to the capital? Did Pharaoh himself perish beneath the waves, or did he survive to witness the destruction of his kingdom's finest soldiers? How did mothers, wives and children react when their loved ones failed to come home? Who ruled Egypt after such a catastrophe? Did the greatest empire of its age collapse overnight, or somehow recover? And perhaps the most intriguing question of all, if this truly was one of the greatest disasters in Egyptian history, why does the Bible suddenly become silent about Egypt? And why have Egyptian records never told us their side of the story? Today we'll step beyond the familiar Exodus narrative to investigate one of history's greatest unanswered questions. Not the story of Israel after the Red Sea, but the story of Egypt after the sea closed. Before we can uncover what may have happened inside Egypt, we first need to return to the days leading up to that unforgettable morning, when one man's refusal set in motion events that would change the course of history forever. Long before the waters parted, before songs of victory echoed across the shore, and before Egypt faced what may have been its darkest national tragedy, there was a confrontation inside Pharaoh's royal court. Standing before the ruler of the most powerful kingdom of the ancient world were two elderly brothers, Moses and Aaron. Their message was astonishingly simple. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." To Pharaoh the request was outrageous. The Israelites were not merely servants, they were an essential part of Egypt's workforce. For generations they had labored on massive construction projects, worked the fields and fueled the prosperity of one of history's greatest civilizations. Releasing them was more than an act of compassion. It threatened Egypt's economy, challenged Pharaoh's authority, and undermined the very image of the king as a divine ruler whose word could not be questioned. His answer came swiftly. No. What followed would become one of the most dramatic sequences recorded in the Bible. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned to blood. Frogs overwhelmed homes and temples. Gnats and flies spread across the land. Disease struck livestock. Painful boils covered people and animals alike. A devastating hailstorm destroyed crops. Locusts consumed what little remained. Darkness covered Egypt for 3 terrifying days. Each plague struck at the heart of Egyptian life, exposing the helplessness of a kingdom that believed itself protected by powerful gods. Yet after every warning, Pharaoh hardened his resolve. Until the final plague. In a single night, death entered Egypt. From the palace to the poorest household, the firstborn of every family perished. The cries that rose across the kingdom were unlike anything Egypt had ever known. Broken and defeated, Pharaoh finally surrendered. He ordered Moses and the Israelites to leave immediately. After centuries of slavery, the people of Israel gathered their families, their possessions, and began their journey out of Egypt. For a brief moment, it appeared the conflict was over. But as the dust settled and reality began to sink in, Pharaoh faced the consequences of his decision. An enormous labor force had vanished. The kingdom had endured repeated disasters. And perhaps anger soon replaced grief. Whatever his reasoning, Pharaoh made one final, fateful decision. He would pursue the Israelites. Gathering his elite chariot divisions, the pride of Egypt's military, along with horsemen and soldiers, he set out across the desert to bring his former slaves back by force. Soon the Israelites found themselves trapped. Mountains stood on either side. The sea stretched out before them. And behind them, a cloud of dust marked the rapid approach of Pharaoh's army. Then, according to the biblical account, something extraordinary happened. God commanded Moses to stretch out his staff over the waters. A strong east wind blew throughout the night. The sea divided. A path of dry ground appeared where there had once been only water. The Israelites crossed safely to the opposite shore. Believing the path remained open, the Egyptian army followed. But when the last of Israel had reached safety, the waters returned. In a matter of moments, Egypt's pursuit came to an end beneath the waves. By sunrise, Israel stood free on the far shore. Behind them lay the shattered remains of Egypt's military might. Ahead of them stretched the wilderness. But hundreds of miles away, another story was only beginning. Because while Israel was singing songs of deliverance, Egypt was waiting for an army that might never return. As dawn broke over the shores of the Red Sea, two nations stood on opposite sides of one of history's most unforgettable moments. On one side stood Israel, exhausted, amazed, finally free. On the other side lay the shattered remains of Egypt's military force. The Bible describes the scene in remarkably simple words. The waters returned and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. For Israel, this was the end of slavery. But for Egypt, it may have been the beginning of a national catastrophe. Yet before we continue, we need to ask an important question. What exactly happened to Pharaoh? It may come as a surprise, but the Bible never explicitly says that Pharaoh himself drowned in the Red Sea. This is one of the most overlooked details in the entire Exodus story. Many paintings, films, and children's Bible stories show Pharaoh being swallowed by the sea alongside his soldiers. It's an image that has become deeply rooted in popular imagination. But when we read the biblical text carefully, something interesting emerges. The passage repeatedly mentions Pharaoh's army, his chariots, his horsemen, and his officers. Yet it never directly says, Pharaoh died. That silence has led to two major interpretations. The traditional view held by many Jewish and Christian readers throughout history is that Pharaoh entered the sea with his army and perished with them. Since he personally led the pursuit, many believe he shared the same fate as his soldiers. Another interpretation argues that Pharaoh may never have entered the seabed at all. Some scholars suggest he remained behind to oversee the pursuit while his army advanced first. In that reading, the army was destroyed, but Pharaoh survived to witness one of the greatest military disasters Egypt had ever faced. The truth is that the Bible doesn't settle the question, and that's important. Throughout this documentary, we'll distinguish between what Scripture clearly tells us, what historians can reasonably infer, and what remains unknown. Whether Pharaoh lived or died, however, one fact is beyond dispute within the biblical narrative. Egypt had just lost the core of its military power. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to understand what Pharaoh had sent into the pursuit. This wasn't an ordinary group of soldiers. According to the biblical account, Pharaoh mobilized 600 of his finest chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, each commanded by experienced officers. In the ancient world, chariots were the equivalent of elite armored divisions. They were expensive to build. They required specially trained horses. Their crews were highly skilled professionals. And they represented the pride and striking power of Egypt's military. Losing such a force wasn't simply a battlefield defeat. It meant losing experienced commanders, veteran soldiers, valuable equipment, and years of military training in a single event. Imagine a modern nation suddenly losing a significant portion of its most elite combat units in one day. The military consequences would be enormous. The political consequences could be even greater. If the biblical account reflects such a disaster, Egypt would not simply be mourning individual soldiers. It would be mourning fathers, sons, commanders, nobles, and trusted officers whose absence would be felt across every level of society. And yet, this is where the biblical narrative does something unexpected. After describing the destruction of Egypt's army, it turns away. The camera follows Israel into the wilderness. Egypt disappears from the story. No account of the palace. No description of grieving families. No mention of a royal funeral. No record of a succession crisis. Only silence. So, what might have been happening behind the palace walls while Israel celebrated on the opposite shore? To answer that question, we have to leave the biblical narrative for a moment and step into the world of ancient Egyptian history. Because although Scripture says almost nothing about Egypt after the Red Sea, history gives us enough pieces to begin imagining what that nation may have experienced in the days, weeks, and months that followed. The next part of our story is unlike anything the Bible records. Once the waters of the Red Sea closed over Pharaoh's army, the biblical narrative follows the Israelites into the wilderness. It tells us nothing about the mood inside Egypt, the reaction of its people, or the fate of those left behind. So what follows is not a retelling of Scripture. Instead, it is a historically informed reconstruction based on what we know about life in ancient Egypt, the structure of its society, and how great kingdoms responded to military disasters. Imagine the scene. The sun rises over Egypt. The capital awakens as it always has. Merchants prepare their stalls. Farmers head toward the fields. Priests enter the temples to perform the morning rituals. Life appears normal. But somewhere far beyond the eastern frontier, the king and his army are expected to return. No one yet knows what has happened. Perhaps wives stood at their doorways, expecting to see familiar faces before sunset. Children waited eagerly for fathers who had marched away in magnificent chariots only days before. Officials inside the royal palace likely anticipated news of another Egyptian victory. After all, who could stand against Pharaoh? For centuries, Egypt had dominated the region. Its armies were respected. Its wealth was unmatched. Its king was regarded not merely as a ruler, but as the earthly representative of the gods. Defeat on such a scale would have been almost unimaginable. Hours pass. Then another day. Still no army. No royal procession. No victorious soldiers. Only silence. At some point, that silence would have become impossible to ignore. The first rumors may have arrived before any official report. Travelers, border guards, messengers, perhaps even frightened survivors, if any escaped before the waters returned. No ancient record tells us exactly who carried the news, but someone had to. Imagine being that messenger. How do you walk into the palace of the world's greatest empire and announce that its finest army has vanished? How do you tell royal officials that the elite chariot divisions, the pride of Egypt's military, will never return? How do you explain that an entire campaign ended not with victory, but with complete destruction? If Pharaoh himself had perished, the message becomes even more devastating. The king is gone. The army is gone. The campaign is over. An empire that believed itself invincible suddenly finds itself vulnerable. Even if Pharaoh survived, the kingdom would still be forced to confront an overwhelming loss. The finest officers, veteran soldiers, experienced charioteers, noblemen, military commanders. Thousands of families could have been affected. Throughout history, whenever armies have suffered catastrophic defeats, the pain has extended far beyond the battlefield. Every fallen soldier leaves behind parents, a spouse, children, friends, communities. Ancient Egypt would have been no different. The sounds of celebration that echoed across the Red Sea among the Israelites may have been matched by sounds of grief within Egyptian homes. One nation sang songs of freedom. The other may have wept for those who would never return. Yet amid the sorrow, the kingdom faced an urgent problem. Who would lead Egypt now? Could the government continue functioning after such a devastating blow? And if Pharaoh had indeed died beneath the waves, who would wear the double crown of Egypt next? Those questions would shape the future of one of history's greatest civilizations. And remarkably, ancient Egypt already had answers. For thousands of years, one question has continued to fascinate historians, theologians, and Bible readers alike. What happened to Pharaoh? As we've already seen, the biblical account never explicitly tells us whether the king himself died in the Red Sea. That single omission creates two very different possibilities. The first is the traditional view. Pharaoh entered the sea alongside his army and perished beneath the returning waters. If that is what happened, Egypt had not only lost its military, it had lost its king. The second possibility is that Pharaoh survived while his army was destroyed. Some scholars suggest he may have remained behind the advancing chariot divisions, directing the pursuit rather than leading it into the seabed himself. In that case, he would have returned to Egypt not as a victorious ruler, but as a king forced to explain the greatest military disaster of his reign. The Bible doesn't tell us which of these scenarios is correct. But whichever view one accepts, an important question remains. How would Egypt have continued? To answer that, we need to understand something about the ancient Egyptian state. Unlike many kingdoms of the ancient world, Egypt was not held together by one man alone. It was a remarkably organized civilization. Beneath Pharaoh stood an entire system of government that had been refined over centuries. At the center of that system was the vizier, the highest-ranking official in the kingdom after Pharaoh himself. The vizier oversaw the administration of justice, supervised royal building projects, managed state records, coordinated taxation, and ensured that the machinery of government continued to function. Alongside him were governors responsible for Egypt's provinces, military commanders overseeing regional defenses, royal scribes preserving government records, and high priests maintaining the religious life that was central to Egyptian society. In other words, Egypt possessed a bureaucracy capable of keeping the kingdom running even during periods of crisis. If Pharaoh had died, the government would not simply have ceased to exist overnight. Instead, its highest officials would have faced one immediate priority: the succession. Unlike modern democracies with written constitutions and scheduled elections, ancient Egypt relied on dynastic succession. Whenever possible, the throne passed to a son of the reigning pharaoh. If no suitable heir was available, another close member of the royal family might assume power. The exact process varied across Egypt's long history, and periods of succession were not always peaceful. Some transitions occurred smoothly. Others sparked rival claims and political instability. Without knowing which pharaoh, if any, stood behind the Exodus narrative, historians cannot say with certainty who would have inherited the throne. But they can say this: Egypt had survived royal deaths before. Kings had died unexpectedly. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Yet the civilization itself endured. Its institutions proved remarkably resilient. If the Exodus unfolded as described in the Bible, the loss of Pharaoh, even combined with the destruction of his army, would almost certainly have plunged the kingdom into a period of mourning, uncertainty, and political adjustment. But it would not necessarily have meant the end of Egypt. In fact, history tells us something remarkable. For centuries after the period in which many scholars place the Exodus, Egypt remained one of the dominant powers of the ancient Near East. It continued building monuments, conducting trade, waging wars, and ruling vast territories. That raises another important question. If Egypt survived, how did it recover from losing an entire slave population, an elite army, and possibly its king? To answer that, we need to look beyond the palace and examine the economic and military consequences that such a disaster would have left behind. Because rebuilding an empire is never as simple as crowning a new king. If we accept the biblical account of the Exodus, one question naturally follows. How could any nation survive a disaster of this magnitude? Think about what Egypt had already endured. Within a relatively short period, the land had suffered a series of devastating plagues. Its agriculture had been damaged. Its livestock had been struck. Its economy had been disrupted. Its firstborn sons had died. Then, just as the nation attempted to recover, a vast Israelite population departed from Egypt. Finally came the destruction of Pharaoh's pursuing army. On paper, it sounds like the perfect recipe for the collapse of an empire. Yet history tells a different story. Egypt did not disappear. It remained one of the great civilizations of the ancient world for centuries afterward. How was that possible? The answer lies in understanding the remarkable strength of the Egyptian state. First, let's consider the military. Although the Bible emphasizes the destruction of Pharaoh's pursuing force, it doesn't say that every soldier in Egypt was lost. Ancient kingdoms rarely marched their entire military into a single campaign. Frontier garrisons still guarded distant borders. Fortresses remained occupied. Regional commanders continued overseeing local defenses. Even after a devastating defeat, Egypt would still have possessed the resources to recruit and train new soldiers. Replacing experienced officers and elite charioteers would have taken years. But rebuilding an army was not impossible. History is filled with nations that suffered catastrophic military defeats only to recover and fight again. The economy presents another challenge. The departure of the Israelites meant the loss of a significant labor force. The Bible portrays them as working on major construction projects and performing forced labor throughout Egypt. Losing thousands of workers would certainly have affected productivity. But Egypt's economy did not depend on a single group alone. Millions of native Egyptians farmed the Nile Valley, worked in workshops, managed trade, and maintained the daily life of the kingdom. Forced labor also came from prisoners of war and other subject peoples at different periods of Egyptian history. In other words, while the departure of the Israelites would have created a serious economic disruption, it would not necessarily have brought Egyptian civilization to a standstill. Then there was the question of religion. Perhaps no institution faced a greater challenge than the temples. For centuries, Pharaoh had been regarded as the chosen representative of the gods. His victories demonstrated divine favor. His authority reflected cosmic order. But what happens when a king publicly defies the God of Israel, pursues a fleeing nation, and returns with neither victory nor army? Whether one approaches the Exodus as history, theology, or a combination of both, the biblical narrative presents a profound challenge to Egypt's religious worldview. For the people of Israel, the crossing of the Red Sea became undeniable proof of God's power. For Egypt, if the events unfolded as described, it would have raised deeply unsettling questions. Had the gods abandoned Pharaoh? Had the kingdom misunderstood the disaster? Or was this simply a tragedy beyond human explanation? The Bible doesn't tell us how Egyptian priests answered those questions. History remains silent. And that silence leaves room only for careful speculation. not certainty. Perhaps the greatest surprise is this: empires are often far more resilient than we imagine. They bend, they weaken, they suffer defeats, but they do not always break. Egypt had survived invasions, periods of famine, internal struggles, the deaths of kings, and political upheaval long before and long after the period associated with the Exodus. Its ability to recover was one of the reasons it remained one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. But as remarkable as Egypt's resilience was, another mystery has puzzled historians for generations. If the Exodus truly represented such a defining moment, why don't the Egyptians tell us anything about it? Why do their monuments celebrate victories, yet remain silent about what may have been their greatest defeat? To answer that question, we must examine not the silence of the Bible, but the silence of history itself. If the destruction of Pharaoh's army truly unfolded as described in the Bible, then one question towers above all the others. Why don't the Egyptians mention it? After all, the ancient Egyptians left behind an astonishing number of records. Their temples were covered with inscriptions. Their monuments celebrated military victories. Their tombs preserved the achievements of kings. From towering obelisks to massive stone walls, Egypt documented much of its history in remarkable detail. So why is there no inscription that reads, "Today our army was destroyed in the sea"? The answer may lie in understanding how ancient history was written. Unlike modern historians, Egyptian royal scribes were not independent observers. They worked for the king. Their purpose was not to produce objective history in the modern sense, but to glorify Pharaoh, reinforce his legitimacy, and present Egypt as a nation favored by the gods. Victories were carved into stone. Triumphs were immortalized in temples. Defeats were often ignored. This wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the ancient world, kings rarely advertised their failures. Imagine if every defeated ruler throughout history had commissioned monuments celebrating military disasters. Very few did. Instead, they emphasized victories, minimized setbacks, and protected the image of royal power. That means the absence of an Egyptian record does not automatically prove that the Exodus never happened. But neither does it prove that it did. This distinction is crucial. Silence is not the same as evidence. It can be meaningful, but by itself it cannot settle the debate. That brings us to archaeology. For more than a century, archaeologists, biblical scholars, and historians have searched for evidence that might clarify the Exodus. Some researchers believe the biblical account preserves the memory of a real historical event that was passed down through generations before being written in its present form. Others argue that the Exodus is primarily a theological narrative, crafted to explain Israel's identity, covenant with God, and national origins rather than to serve as a detailed historical chronicle. Still others suggest a middle position. They propose that a smaller historical migration or escape from Egypt may have occurred, later becoming the foundation for the larger biblical narrative we know today. Each of these perspectives is supported by different interpretations of the available evidence. And despite decades of research, no single theory has convinced all scholars. The debate continues. What everyone agrees on, however, is that the Exodus occupies a unique place in history. Whether viewed through the lens of faith, archaeology, or ancient literature, it remains one of the most influential stories ever told. Its impact extends far beyond the shores of the Red Sea. It has shaped religious belief, inspired movements for freedom, influenced literature and art, and become central to the identity of millions of people across thousands of years. Perhaps that is why the silence surrounding Egypt feels so striking. The Bible tells the story from Israel's perspective. Egyptian monuments tell the story from Pharaoh's perspective. Each source has its own purpose. Each preserves its own memory. And somewhere between those voices lies a past that historians continue to explore. The truth is, we may never discover an ancient scroll describing the day the sea closed. We may never uncover the diary of an Egyptian commander who survived to tell the tale. Some questions may remain unanswered, but perhaps that is what makes history so compelling. It is not only a record of what we know, it is also an invitation to investigate what we do not. And that brings us to one final reflection. What if the greatest story hidden by the Red Sea isn't about how one nation escaped, but about how two nations walked away from the same event with completely different futures? When the sun rose over the Red Sea that morning, the world had changed forever. The same event, the same sea, the same stretch of shoreline, produced two completely different stories. For Israel, the Red Sea was not merely an escape, it was the birth of a nation. For generations they had known only slavery. Their parents had been slaves. Their grandparents had been slaves. Entire generations had lived and died believing that Egypt was the center of their world. Then, in a single night, everything changed. The chains that had defined their past were gone. The army that had terrified them was no more. The impossible had become reality. For the first time in centuries, Israel no longer belonged to Pharaoh. They belonged only to God. That is why the crossing of the Red Sea occupies such a central place in the Bible. It was more than a miracle. It was a declaration. The God who had delivered Israel from Egypt would now lead them through the wilderness, establish a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and begin shaping them into a people unlike any other nation on earth. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be hunger, thirst, rebellion, 40 years of wandering. Yet despite every challenge, Israel would never again return to slavery in Egypt. The sea had become the line that separated their old life from their new one. But while Israel walked toward its future, Egypt was walking into a very different chapter. If the biblical account unfolded as described, then somewhere west of the Red Sea, an empire was trying to understand the unthinkable. Palace officials would have faced impossible decisions. Military commanders would have begun assessing the kingdom's defenses. Families may have mourned fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons. Priests would have sought answers in temples dedicated to gods who, from Israel's perspective, had been powerless to prevent disaster. And if Pharaoh himself had died, an entire nation would have begun preparing for the transfer of royal power. Yet history has a remarkable way of surprising us. Empires often survive tragedies that seem impossible to overcome. Egypt did. Its civilization endured. Its cities continued to flourish. Its monuments continued to rise. Its armies marched again. Future pharaohs would rule from the same palaces. Builders would carve new temples from stone. Merchants would continue sailing the Nile. Life, as it so often does after catastrophe, found a way to continue. That may be one of history's greatest lessons. Great civilizations are not remembered because they never suffered. They are remembered because they endured. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is not what happened. It is what didn't happen. The Bible never returns to Egypt. Once Israel steps onto the far shore, the camera follows them into the wilderness and never looks back. It tells us nothing about the rebuilding of Egypt. Nothing about the palace after the disaster. Nothing about the grieving families. Nothing about the next pharaoh. Nothing about how ordinary Egyptians explained the events they had just experienced. Instead, there is silence. And in that silence, generations have asked the same questions we have explored today. Did Pharaoh die beneath the waves? How did the kingdom recover? Why don't Egyptian records describe such a catastrophe? Was the Exodus exactly as the Bible describes it? Did it preserve the memory of a real historical event? Or are some parts of the story beyond the reach of archaeology? These questions continue to inspire debate among historians, archaeologists, theologians, and Bible readers alike. Some approach the Exodus primarily through faith, others through historical investigation. Many seek to understand it through both. And while those perspectives may differ, they all recognize the extraordinary influence this story has had on human history. For more than 3,000 years, the Exodus has shaped civilizations. It has inspired songs, literature, paintings, films, and movements for justice and freedom across the world. Its message has echoed far beyond the borders of ancient Egypt. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not found in what the Bible says, but in what it leaves unsaid. History is often described as being written by the victors. But the story of the Red Sea reminds us that history is also shaped by perspective. The Bible tells the story through the eyes of Israel. It celebrates deliverance, freedom, hope, a covenant between God and his people. If an Egyptian royal scribe had recorded the same morning, the account might have sounded very different. Perhaps it would have spoken of a kingdom struck by unimaginable loss, of soldiers who never returned, of a palace thrown into mourning, of priests searching desperately for meaning, of officials struggling to preserve order after the greatest military catastrophe their generation had ever known. Would that account agree with the Bible? Would it contradict it? Or would it reveal details that have been lost to time? We simply don't know. Perhaps one day, buried beneath the sands of Egypt, archaeologists will uncover an inscription, a forgotten papyrus, or the personal writings of an official who witnessed those events. Perhaps they won't. Some mysteries survive because history is incomplete. Others survive because they continue to challenge us to ask better questions. And maybe that is exactly why the story of the Red Sea has never lost its power. It is more than the story of water dividing. It is more than the story of Pharaoh or Moses. It is the story of a single moment that sent two civilizations in opposite directions. One nation walked away believing it had witnessed the saving power of God. The other, if the biblical account reflects history, was left to rebuild after one of the darkest days it had ever known. One sea, one morning, two futures. Thousands of years later, we are still trying to understand what really happened on both sides of those waters. And perhaps that is the greatest reminder history can offer us. Sometimes, the most fascinating stories are not the ones that are fully told, but the ones that leave us searching for the missing pages. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to see more explorations of the untold stories behind the Bible, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. What do you think happened inside Egypt after the Red Sea? Do you believe Pharaoh died with his army? Do you think Egypt deliberately erased its greatest defeat from history? Or do you think the truth lies somewhere between faith, history, and archaeology? Whatever your perspective, one thing is certain. The waters of the Red Sea may have closed thousands of years ago, but the questions they left behind are still open today. There is something remarkable about the story of the Exodus, not simply because of what it tells us, but because of what it doesn't. Throughout this documentary, we've followed a trail of clues that began on the shores of the Red Sea. We asked questions the biblical narrative leaves unanswered. What happened when Egypt's army never returned? Did Pharaoh die beneath the waves, or did he survive the greatest humiliation of his reign? How did an empire recover from losing its elite military force? Why did Egypt continue to flourish despite such a devastating catastrophe? And perhaps the greatest question of all, why does history seem to fall silent just when we want answers the most? The truth is, history is rarely as complete as we wish it were. Ancient civilizations did not preserve every event. Many records have been lost to war, fire, floods, decay, and the passage of thousands of years. Others may still lie buried beneath layers of sand, waiting to be discovered. Some may never be found. The Egypt we know today represents only a fraction of the civilization that once stood along the Nile. Even after more than 2 centuries of archaeological exploration, experts estimate that much of ancient Egypt remains unexcavated. Every year, archaeologists uncover new tombs, forgotten settlements, abandoned temples, and inscriptions that reshape our understanding of the ancient world. That means history is still being written. It is entirely possible that future discoveries could answer questions we cannot answer today. Or they may raise entirely new ones. But regardless of what future excavations reveal, one fact remains undeniable. The Exodus story changed the world. Whether viewed as sacred history, theological narrative, historical memory, or a combination of these, its influence reaches far beyond ancient Egypt. Its themes of freedom, deliverance, justice, faith, and hope have inspired countless generations. The story has been read by kings and peasants, quoted by reformers, studied by historians, debated by archaeologists, celebrated in places of worship across the world. Few events, real, remembered, or symbolic, have left such a profound mark on human civilization. And yet, one fascinating detail often escapes our attention. The Bible never tries to answer every historical question. Its purpose was never to provide a complete political history of Egypt. It was written to tell the story of God's relationship with his people. Once Israel crossed the sea, the focus shifted entirely. Egypt became part of Israel's past. The wilderness became Israel's future. For the biblical authors, that was where the story needed to go. But for historians, that is exactly where the questions begin. History and faith often ask different kinds of questions. Faith asks, what does this event mean? History asks, what happened? Archaeology asks, what evidence remains? Each discipline approaches the same story from a different direction. None completely replaces the others. Instead, they invite us into a richer conversation about one of humanity's oldest narratives. That is why responsible historians distinguish between what can be demonstrated, what can reasonably be inferred, and what remains uncertain. Throughout this documentary, we've tried to do the same. Where the Bible speaks clearly, we've followed its account. Where archaeology provides evidence, we've considered it. Where the historical record becomes silent, we've acknowledged that silence instead of pretending certainty. Because sometimes, admitting what we don't know is just as important as explaining what we do. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within the untold story of Egypt after the Red Sea. Not every question has an answer. Not every mystery can be solved. But every unanswered question encourages us to keep searching, to keep learning, and to keep approaching history with both curiosity and humility. One day, perhaps, a forgotten inscription will emerge from beneath the Egyptian sands. Perhaps a royal archive still waits undiscovered. Perhaps an overlooked papyrus will offer a glimpse into those mysterious days after the Red Sea. Until then, the story remains unfinished, not because history has failed us, but because history is still revealing itself. And maybe that's what makes the ancient world so endlessly fascinating. Its greatest mysteries are not locked away forever. They are simply waiting for the next generation to uncover them. Imagine standing on the shores of the Red Sea as the morning sun rises. Behind you, a nation sings, children laugh, families embrace. The impossible has become reality. For the Israelites, this is the first sunrise of freedom. Now turn around. Look across the waters. Beyond the distant horizon lies Egypt, a civilization that, according to the biblical account, has just endured a catastrophe unlike any in its history. Somewhere along the Nile, homes may have remained silent, waiting for footsteps that would never be heard again. Somewhere inside the royal palace, officials may have struggled to understand how everything had changed so quickly. Somewhere in the temples, priests may have searched for answers that never came. Two nations, one sea, one defining moment. Yet each walked away carrying a completely different story. Perhaps that is why the Exodus continues to captivate the world after thousands of years. It is not simply a story about miracles. It is a story about perspective, about memory, about history, about faith, and about the questions that survive long after the events themselves have passed. Whether you approach this account as a believer, a historian, an archaeologist, or simply someone fascinated by the ancient world, one thing is certain. The story of the Red Sea is far larger than a single crossing. It marks the end of one chapter in human history, and the beginning of another. The Bible follows Israel into the wilderness. History invites us to look back toward Egypt. Between those two paths lies one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Perhaps we will never know every detail of what happened after the waters closed. But maybe that isn't the point. Sometimes the value of history isn't found only in the answers it gives us. It's found in the questions that continue to inspire us to search. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, the next chapter of this story is still waiting to be discovered. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration into the untold stories of history and the Bible. Now I'd love to hear from you. What do you think happened inside Egypt after the Red Sea? Do you believe Pharaoh died with his army? Did Egypt intentionally erase one of its greatest defeats? Or do you think the real story is even more complex than we've imagined? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep asking questions, because sometimes the most fascinating discoveries begin with a single mystery.